An HOA Karen calls cops on veteran with service dog, unaware who his son is. Mike Callahan sat on his porch, sipping his morning coffee while Ranger, his golden retriever service dog, lay obediently at his feet. The warm breeze rustled the trees, and for the first time in years, peace felt within reach. After decades of service, through battlefields and war zones, he had finally found a place to settle down. The quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek promised the tranquility he longed for. But peace, as he had learned over the years, was always fragile. A sharp voice cut through the morning calm. "You there?" Mike looked up to see a woman storming toward him. She was in her late 50s, immaculately dressed in a beige pantsuit, her short bob hair stiff with layers of hairspray. Her lips were pursed as though permanently tasting something sour. "I'm Karen Whitmore, the president of the Homeowners Association," she declared, folding her arms. "You must be the new resident. I was hoping to have a chat before things got complicated." Mike raised an eyebrow but remained seated. "Complicated how?" Karen's eyes flicked down to Ranger, who was resting his head on Mike's boots. "That thing," she said with disdain, "isn't allowed in our neighborhood. We have strict policies against large dogs. It's a safety issue." Mike set his coffee cup down with deliberate calm. "Ranger is my service dog. Federal law protects my right to have him." Karen scoffed. "Oh, I know all about those so-called service animals. Everyone's slapping a vest on their mutt and calling it necessary. But here in Willow Creek, we value order. We can't have an unpredictable animal scaring the neighbors." Mike's grip tightened around his cup. He had endured a lifetime of battles, on the field and within his own mind. He had faced enemies more ruthless than a self-righteous HOA president. He inhaled deeply, keeping his voice steady. "He's not just a dog. He saved my life in combat more times than I can count. And he's trained to help me with my PTSD." Karen's face twisted with something between annoyance and amusement. "PTSD? Look, I respect what you did for the country, but that doesn't mean the rules don't apply to you. If anything, you should be setting an example for discipline." Mike stared at her, momentarily speechless. The woman had no idea who she was talking to, and he had no intention of wasting energy trying to make her understand. Before he could respond, she pulled out a folder and handed him a document. "This is the HOA's guidelines on pet ownership. You'll see we have a strict weight limit for dogs. You're in violation, which means you'll need to remove the animal or face fines. If you refuse, we'll have no choice but to escalate matters." Ranger let out a low growl, sensing the tension. Mike didn't take the paper. "I'm not removing my dog," he said firmly. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then you leave me no choice." With that, she turned on her heel and strode away, her heels clicking against the pavement. Mike watched her go, a storm brewing behind his eyes. She had no idea what kind of battle she had just started. The next morning, Mike was jolted awake by the sharp knock at his door. He instinctively reached for the pistol he kept in his bedside drawer. Old habits died hard. But as reality settled in, he exhaled, setting the gun down before heading to answer the door. Two uniformed officers stood on his porch, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. Callahan?" the taller officer asked. Mike nodded. "That's me. We received a complaint about an aggressive dog on your property." The officer continued. "Your neighbor reported feeling threatened." Mike didn't need to guess who had made the complaint. "That's ridiculous," he said, stepping aside. "Ranger wouldn't hurt a fly." The officers exchanged glances before the shorter one sighed. "Look, we understand service animals are protected under the law, but the HOA has its own rules. If enough complaints are filed, things could get complicated." Mike's patience thinned. "So you're telling me that because some woman doesn't like my dog, I'm at risk of losing my home?" The taller officer hesitated before lowering his voice. "Off the record? This HOA's got a history of pushing people out they don't like. They'll keep making your life miserable until you either comply or leave." Mike felt the familiar tension in his chest, the same feeling he'd had in combat when he knew trouble was brewing. You guys got a boss? He asked. The officers looked at each other before nodding. Good, Mike said. Because I'd like to file my own complaint. That night, Mike sat in his study, phone pressed to his ear. It's happening again, he said. On the other end of the line, his son, Jason Callahan, exhaled sharply. Let me guess, HOA trouble? Some power-hungry woman named Karen, Mike confirmed. She's trying to get rid of Ranger, and now she's calling the cops. Jason was silent for a moment before he asked, Does she know who I am? Mike smirked. Nope. Good, Jason replied. Let's keep it that way for now. Jason Callahan wasn't just any ordinary man. He was a billionaire tech mogul, the CEO of Callahan Industries, and one of the most influential businessmen in the country. He had built an empire from the ground up, and though he rarely involved himself in personal disputes, no one messed with his father. Give me a few days, Jason said. I'll take care of it. Mike leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at his lips. Karen had no idea the storm that was about to hit her. And by the time Jason was done, she would wish she had never knocked on his door. The following morning, Mike noticed an unusual quietness in the neighborhood. It wasn't the peaceful kind, more like the eerie silence before a storm. As he stepped onto his porch, Ranger at his side, he saw several of his neighbors staring at him. Some quickly looked away, while others exchanged whispers. Something was up. He didn't have to wait long to find out what. A white luxury SUV rolled into his driveway, and out stepped Karen, flanked by two other HOA board members. One was a lanky man with glasses, clutching a clipboard like a lifeline. The other was a petite woman in a floral dress who avoided looking at Mike directly. Karen, however, was as smug as ever. Mr. Callahan, she said in a tone dripping with forced politeness. I'm afraid we have an issue that requires immediate attention. Mike crossed his arms. And what might that be? Karen gestured toward the clipboard man, who cleared his throat nervously and read from his notes. After reviewing our regulations, the board has decided that your dog does not meet the necessary conditions for residency in this community. Due to multiple complaints from residents, we are officially giving you a notice of violation. Mike's lips twitched into a humorless smile. Multiple complaints? He scanned the neighborhood. Strange, I haven't heard a single one from my neighbors. Karen waved dismissively. Well, not everyone is comfortable confronting it. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Man of your background. But rest assured, the complaints are legitimate. Mike didn't buy it. So, what's the next step in your grand plan? The clipboard man hesitated before continuing. You have 72 hours to either remove the animal or vacate the property. Otherwise, further legal action will be pursued. Mike clenched his jaw. That's not how the law works, and you know it. Karen's smile was sickly sweet. You're right. But this is HOA territory, Mr. Callahan. We have ways of making things difficult. With that, she turned and strutted back to her SUV, her lackeys scrambling to keep up. Mike watched her go, feeling the first flickers of real anger. She wasn't just bluffing, she truly believed she could force him out. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. It started small. First, his mailbox disappeared. Not vandalized, just completely gone. Then, his trash bins weren't picked up, despite the rest of the neighborhood having no issues. The real kicker came when he tried to access his own garage. His HOA-issued security keycard no longer worked. Karen was playing dirty. Mike knew he could fight back legally, but something told him that wouldn't be enough. Karen wasn't afraid of laws, she was afraid of power. And Mike had the best kind of power in his corner. It was time to see how far she was willing to go before she realized she was digging her own grave. Mike's phone buzzed that evening. Hey, Dad. Jason's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. I looked into that HOA. Mike leaned back in his chair. And? They've been sued twice in the past for wrongful evictions and discrimination. Karen, in particular, has a habit of bullying people into leaving if they don't fit her ideal community image. She always gets away with it because most people can't afford the fight. Mike exhaled slowly. She's not going to get away with it this time. Jason chuckled. She has no idea who she's dealing with. There was a pause before Jason continued. By the way, did you know that Callahan Industries owns a large share of the real estate company that manages your neighborhood? Mike raised an eyebrow. No, but I'm guessing that's useful. Oh, it's more than useful, Jason said, a hint of amusement in his voice. It means that, legally, I have a say in how this HOA operates. And I think it's time we make some changes. Mike smirked. How fast can you make it happen? Jason didn't hesitate. Give me 24 hours. The next morning, the entire neighborhood woke up to something none of them had expected. A moving truck was parked outside Karen's house. Not Mike's. Karen's. Confused residents gathered, whispering among themselves as workers in crisp uniforms carried furniture out of her house. Karen stormed out in a bathrobe, screaming at the movers. What the hell is going on? She shrieked, trying to block them from entering. One of the movers, unfazed by her outburst, handed her a document. Your eviction notice, ma'am. Her face went pale. Eviction? This is my house. A deep, amused voice answered from behind her. Not anymore. Karen spun around to see Jason Callahan standing on her driveway, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, hands in his pockets, exuding an aura of absolute control. I looked into the HOA's financials. Jason continued. Turns out, you've been skimming money from the community fund for years. That's a felony, by the way. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. That's not true. Jason ignored her. Since I own part of the real estate firm managing this neighborhood, I had my legal team dig into the contracts. Turns out, your house isn't technically in your name. It's listed under the HOA trust. Karen went stiff. Jason's smirk widened. So, when I pulled a few strings, I had the HOA vote you out. Unanimously, I might add. You no longer live here, Karen. Karen's face turned red, veins bulging at her temples. You can't do this. I have rights. Jason tilted his head. Oh, you do. And you're welcome to fight it in court. But considering the embezzlement charges you're about to face, I don't think you'll be focused on housing disputes for a while. The color drained from Karen's face. Jason stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You messed with my father, he said, his tone deadly serious. That was your first mistake. Thinking you could win was your second. Karen stumbled back, her breath shallow. Now I suggest you leave quietly before things get worse. For the first time in her life, Karen Whitmore had nothing to say. The neighborhood of Willow Creek had never been this silent. Karen Whitmore, who once ruled the HOA with an iron grip, was gone, evicted in one of the most humiliating ways imaginable. But the chaos she had unleashed wasn't over yet. Mike Callahan knew this wasn't the kind of battle that ended overnight. Power-hungry people like Karen didn't just disappear, they plotted. And that's exactly what she was doing. Despite her very public downfall, Karen wasn't finished. Though she had been stripped of her title, removed from her home, and exposed for her corruption, she still had one last trick up her sleeve: manipulation. The day after her eviction, a new rumor began spreading through the community. It started subtly, neighbors murmuring at mailboxes, whispers exchanged during morning walks. Did you hear about the new guy? The veteran? Yeah, apparently his son is some kind of billionaire. He bought out the HOA just to get revenge on Karen. He's trying to take over the neighborhood. I heard he wants to bulldoze the whole place and turn it into some high-end real estate project. Mike noticed the shift almost immediately. The warm greetings from his neighbors became hesitant nods. The friendly waves turned into quick glances before doors shut. Karen might have been gone, but her poison was still seeping into the cracks of Willow Creek. Mike wasn't one for politics or social games. He'd spent most of his life in war zones where respect was earned, not whispered behind someone's back. But this was something different. And it pissed him off. That evening, Jason called. I had a feeling she wouldn't go quietly, he said after Mike explained the situation. She's smart in a nasty way. People like that know how to turn fear into a weapon. Yeah, well, she's turning the whole neighborhood against me, Mike grumbled. I don't care what they think of me, but if they start messing with Ranger, Jason cut him off. They won't get the chance. Mike could hear the edge in his son's voice, the same one he had when dealing with high-stakes corporate enemies. You want me to handle it? Jason asked. Mike considered it. His son was more than capable of taking down Karen's smear campaign in a heartbeat. A few well-placed calls, a little pressure from the right sources, and she'd be done for good. But that wasn't his way. Not yet, Mike finally said. Let's see what she's really up to first. Jason didn't argue. All right. But if this gets worse, I'm stepping in. Mike sighed, running a hand over his face. I have a feeling it's about to. 2 nights later, it happened. It started with a loud knock on Mike's door at midnight. Ranger immediately snapped to attention, his ears perked, body tense. Mike wasn't the type to answer a door without knowing what was on the other side, so he grabbed his flashlight and peered through the peephole. A group of people stood outside, their faces barely visible under the dim porch light. Something felt off. Mr. Callahan! A familiar voice rang out. It was Mark Stevens, one of the HOA board members who had been present during Karen's stunt. We need to talk. Mike debated ignoring them, but he knew that wouldn't make them go away. He opened the door just enough to see them properly. Mark looked nervous. Behind him were 2 other board members and a handful of residents, all standing stiffly like they'd rather be anywhere else. We just wanted to clear the air, Mark stammered. There's been a lot of talk about what happened with Karen. Mike kept his expression blank. And? Mark shifted uncomfortably. Well, some of us are just concerned. You know, with your son's connections and all, people are worried about what this means for Willow Creek. Mike didn't blink. You mean the rumors Karen started? Mark swallowed hard. She said you were planning to change the neighborhood. That you wanted to take over the HOA. Some folks are worried about their homes. Mike let out a slow breath. So that was her plan. She was painting him and Jason as villains, making the community think they were the real threat. It was clever. Too bad he'd seen worse tactics in war. I'm not here to change anything, Mike said flatly. I moved here because I wanted peace. Karen made that impossible. Mark hesitated. So you're saying you're not going to retaliate? Mike frowned. Retaliate? Mark glanced at the other residents, then lowered his voice. Someone vandalized Karen's car last night. Mike stiffened. And you think it was me? We're not accusing you of anything, Mark said quickly. It's just, well, with everything that happened, some people think you or your son might have sent a message. Mike clenched his jaw. He wasn't a fool, this was a setup. And it stunk of Karen's handiwork. You want the truth? Mike said, his voice sharp. I don't care about Karen or her damn car. But if she's trying to frame me, she's making a big mistake. The crowd shifted uneasily. Mark nodded. All right. We just wanted to ask. Mike watched them go, his gut telling him this was far from over. Karen was still playing the game. And she was getting desperate. The next day, Mike woke up to something he didn't expect. A police car parked in front of his house. 2 officers stood outside, waiting. Mike sighed, rubbing his temples before stepping outside. Let me guess, he called out. Karen's pressing charges? The officers exchanged glances. Sir, one of them said carefully. We're actually here about something else. Mike frowned. What? The officer hesitated before speaking. Karen Whitmore was found unconscious in a parking lot last night. Someone attacked her. Mike's stomach dropped. She's in the hospital. The officer continued. And before she passed out, she told us she believed you or your son had something to do with it. Mike blinked. Excuse me? The other officer spoke up. We're not saying we believe her, but given everything that's happened, we need to ask you a few questions. Mike's mind raced. This wasn't Karen's usual manipulation. Someone had actually attacked her. And now she was trying to drag him and Jason into it. Whatever game she had been playing, it had just taken a dangerous turn. Mike Callahan stood on his porch, staring at the two officers who had just informed him of something he never saw coming. Karen Whitmore had been attacked. And now, she was pointing the finger at him and Jason. Mike had been in countless situations where the wrong move could mean life or death. But this was an entirely different battlefield. One of lies, manipulation, and someone framing him for something he didn't do. His pulse steadied. If there was one thing he had learned from war, it was to never let the enemy see you sweat. "Officers," he said, keeping his voice level, "I had nothing to do with Karen's attack. Neither did my son." The taller officer nodded. "We're not arresting you, Mr. Callahan. We just need to verify your whereabouts last night." Mike folded his arms. "I was home. Ranger and I turned in early." The shorter officer took out a notepad. "Can anyone confirm that?" Mike narrowed his eyes. "What are you getting at?" The officer hesitated. "Well, given the history between you and Mrs. Whitmore, some people believe." "Some people?" Mike cut in. "Or Karen herself?" The taller cop sighed. "Look, she was found badly beaten in a parking lot outside a shopping center. No security cameras, no witnesses. When she woke up in the hospital, she told us she strongly believed you or your son were behind it." Mike's jaw tightened. This was insane. Jason was a lot of things, but reckless wasn't one of them. And if someone had really gone after Karen, then that meant something else was happening here. Something bigger. An hour later, Mike sat at his kitchen table, phone to his ear. "She's playing her last card," Jason said on the other end, his voice calm but with a dangerous edge. "Framing us? That's desperate. Which means she's either covering something up, or she really thinks we did it." Mike finished. Jason exhaled sharply. "Dad, we need to handle this before it spirals out of control. If the police don't find the real attacker, we'll be their easiest targets." Mike rubbed his temples. "You have something in mind?" There was a pause before Jason replied. "I already hired a private investigator. He's looking into it now." Mike blinked. "You did what?" Jason chuckled. "Come on, Dad. You really think I'd let this woman ruin your life and not prepare for it? The guy I hired, his name's Victor Hale. Former intelligence. He's damn good." Mike let out a slow breath. "All right. Let's see what he digs up." Jason's tone turned serious. "In the meantime, stay sharp. If someone really went after Karen, and she thinks we're responsible, there's a good chance the real attacker is still out there." Mike frowned. That thought hadn't fully hit him until now. Karen had a lot of enemies. Maybe this wasn't about him at all. The next evening, Victor Hale called. "I found something," he said without preamble. His voice was rough, like a man who had spent too many years chasing down ghosts. "Karen wasn't attacked at random. This was targeted." Mike leaned forward. "Explain." Victor sighed. "Her finances are a mess. The HOA money she was skimming? It wasn't just for luxury shopping. She owed a lot of money to the wrong people. Gambling debts. And from what I'm seeing, she's been receiving threats for months." Mike's stomach turned. "You're telling me she got herself into real trouble?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Victor confirmed. "And the best part? I have proof." Mike sat up straighter. "What kind of proof?" Victor hesitated. "Security footage. Not from the parking lot where she was attacked, but from a casino 3 nights before. She met with a guy named Luther Cain." Mike clenched his jaw. "That name sounds familiar." "It should," Victor said. "He's a loan shark. Not the kind you take lightly." Mike felt a cold realization creeping in. "You think she owed him money?" "I don't just think it," Victor replied. "I know it. And guess what? The night before her attack, Cain's men were in town." Mike let out a slow, dark chuckle. And instead of admitting she'd pissed off the wrong people, she blamed us. Bingo, Victor said. She's using you and Jason as a shield. She figures if the cops are busy looking at you, they won't be looking at Cain. Mike exhaled, running a hand down his face. Jason's gonna love this. Victor's voice turned serious. Be careful, Callahan. If Cain thinks she ratted on him, he'll make sure she doesn't talk again. And if he finds out we're sniffing around... Mike finished the thought for him. We might be next. Karen Whitmore had spent her entire life controlling people. But for the first time, she was the one being hunted. She sat in her hospital bed, hands shaking as she clutched her phone. She had tried to get in touch with Cain 5 times. No response. That meant one of two things. Either he didn't think she was a threat, or he was about to make sure she wasn't one. Her plan had been simple: divert attention away from herself. The Callahans were the easiest scapegoats. Everyone in the neighborhood already had doubts about them. It was supposed to be foolproof. But now, she wasn't so sure. Her fingers trembled as she typed out a message to the one person who might still listen. Karen, 8:42 p.m. We need to talk. It's urgent. Seconds later, a reply came. Unknown number, 8:43 p.m. Too late for that. Karen felt her breath catch in her throat. Her heart pounded as she typed again. I can fix this. Just give me time. The response came faster this time. Time's up. A cold sweat broke out across her skin. She turned toward the hospital room door, suddenly desperate for someone, anyone. Then, the lights in her room flickered. And Karen Whitmore knew this wasn't over. It was just beginning. Mike Callahan had been through his fair share of danger. He had survived wars, betrayals, and life-threatening situations most people couldn't even fathom. But as he sat in his living room, gripping his phone after hearing Victor Hale's report, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: the cold, familiar instinct of a man preparing for a fight. Karen Whitmore had pointed the finger at him, but the real threat? Luther Cain. A lone shark with a violent reputation. A man whose enemies didn't live long enough to make second mistakes. And now, Cain's trail was leading straight to Mike's doorstep. It didn't take long for Jason to get involved. His voice was sharp over the phone, his usual calm now edged with frustration. She's not just a liar, Jason said. She's a liability. If Cain thinks she's talked, he won't stop until she's gone. And if he finds out we're looking into him... Mike finished the thought. He'll make sure we disappear too. Jason exhaled. I already put a tracker on her hospital room. If Cain or his men come anywhere near her, we'll know. Mike was silent for a moment. His son had always been 3 steps ahead. But this time? It might not be enough. She's not going to survive this, Mike muttered. Jason's voice hardened. She doesn't deserve to. Mike understood his son's anger. Karen had tried to ruin them. But if Cain wanted her finished, letting it happen wasn't an option. Not because she deserved saving, but because dead people didn't talk. And right now, they needed her alive. It happened just past midnight. Ranger's growl was the first thing that alerted Mike. Then, a sound at the back door. Soft. Controlled. Not the sound of an amateur. Mike was up in an instant, instincts from his military days kicking in. He moved silently through the house, pressing his back against the wall near the kitchen. A shadow moved past the window. Not a random thief. Someone watching him. Mike tightened his grip around the pistol he kept holstered by his bed. He didn't make a sound. Didn't move. He just waited. A click. Then, the back door handle turned. Mike's muscles tensed as the door creaked open. A figure stepped inside. Tall. Broad shoulders. Dressed in dark clothing. Armed. Mike didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, he pressed the barrel of his gun to the man's temple. One move, and I paint the walls with you. The intruder froze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, the man slowly raised his hands. Easy now, the stranger said, his voice calm. I'm not here to hurt you. Mike's grip didn't waver. You sure as hell didn't come for a chat. The man exhaled. Name's Marco Ruiz. I work for Luther Cain. He sent me here to talk. Mike's gut tightened. Talk? He repeated. That why you came in like a damn thief? Marco chuckled, though there was no humor in it. Figured you wouldn't be the type to answer the front door. Guess I was right. Mike didn't lower the gun. You have 60 seconds before I decide you're not worth listening to. Marco's face turned serious. Cain knows you and your son are looking into him. He doesn't like it. Mike smirked. And? Marco hesitated. Then, his next words sent ice through Mike's veins. He also knows where Jason is. Mike's blood ran cold. Jason had security. The best money could buy. But Cain wasn't just some street thug. He had resources, connections, men who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. And now? His son was in danger. You tell Cain he just made the biggest mistake of his life. Mike growled. Marco sighed. Look, old man, I don't want trouble. I just follow orders. But Cain? He doesn't play fair. You and your son should disappear before this gets ugly. Mike's grip tightened on his pistol. You came all the way here to tell me that? Marco hesitated. No. Mike narrowed his eyes. Then why? Marco exhaled. Because I think Cain is making a mistake. Mike studied the man carefully. His posture. His tone. His hesitation. Why do you care? Mike asked. Marco looked away for a moment before answering. Because I know what happens when you cross a line you can't come back from. There was something in his voice. Regret. Mike knew that tone. He had heard it in too many soldiers who had seen too much. After a long silence, Marco spoke again. If you want to protect your son, you need to move fast. Cain's men will go after him tonight. Mike didn't wait. He stepped back, lowered his gun, but not completely. Get the hell out of my house, he said. Marco nodded once before slipping back into the night. Mike immediately grabbed his phone and dialed Jason. Yeah? Jason answered after one ring. Listen carefully, Mike said, already grabbing his car keys. Cain is coming for you. Right now. Jason Callahan wasn't the kind of man who panicked. He had built an empire, survived cutthroat business deals, and ruined men far more dangerous than Luther Cain. But when his father called him in the middle of the night, voice tense, he didn't argue. He moved. His security team was already on alert, but it wasn't enough. Cain's men had planned this. The first attack came from the alley behind his building. A black SUV rammed through the gates of the private parking lot. Armed men spilled out, moving fast. Jason's security fired first. Gunshots echoed through the night. Jason was already moving, ducking behind cover as bullets shattered the windows of his office. This wasn't just a scare tactic. They wanted him finished. When Mike pulled up to Jason's office, he didn't hesitate. The street was already a war zone. Security guards exchanged fire with Cain's men, bullets ricocheting off cars and walls. Jason was pinned down near the entrance, using a pillar for cover. Mike didn't think. He moved. Pulling his pistol from his holster, he stepped out of the car and fired 3 precise shots. 3 of Cain's men dropped instantly. The gunfire stopped. For a moment, silence. Then, one of the remaining men bolted. Jason exhaled, stepping out from cover. Took you long enough. Mike smirked. Had to make an entrance. Jason dusted off his jacket. We need to finish this. Cain won't stop. Mike nodded. Agreed. Jason turned to his security chief. Find out where Cain is. Tonight we end this. Mike cracked his knuckles. Luther Cain had just made his final mistake. And now? He was about to learn what happened when he went to war with the Callahans. Luther Cain had built his empire on fear. He thrived in the shadows, striking deals with desperate men and leaving destruction in his wake. No one ever dared to challenge him. Jason's security team worked fast. Within an hour, they had pinpointed Cain's location, a private club on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't just any club. It was a front, a place where criminals brokered deals, debts were collected, and disappearances were arranged. Jason glanced at his father. "You sure about this?" Mike checked his weapon. "We end it tonight." Jason exhaled. "All right. No more warnings." They weren't going in as businessmen. They were going in as soldiers. The club was dimly lit, the air thick with smoke and tension. The moment Mike and Jason walked in, all eyes turned to them. Men at the bar stiffened. Bouncers shifted on their feet. They knew exactly who had just walked in. Luther Cain sat in a private booth, sipping whiskey. Unlike the others, he didn't flinch. Instead, he smirked. Well, he drawled, setting his glass down. "The Callahans finally decided to meet me face to face?" Jason slid into the booth across from him, Mike standing just behind him, arms crossed. "Cut the crap, Cain," Jason said coldly. "You went after my father. You sent men to finish me. You think we're just going to let that slide?" Cain chuckled, shaking his head. "Business, Jason. Nothing personal." Mike's voice was calm but lethal. "That's where you messed up, Cain. You made it personal." Cain leaned back, studying them. "You boys are tough, I'll give you that. But you don't walk into my place, make threats, and walk out untouched." Jason smirked. "Who said we came alone?" The doors burst open. Victor Hale walked in first, gun drawn. Behind him, Jason's security team poured in, weapons at the ready. Cain's men reached for their guns, but stopped when they realized they were already outnumbered. The room went dead silent. Jason leaned in, voice dangerously low. "You've lost, Cain." Cain's jaw clenched. For the first time, he looked uncertain. "You're done," Mike added. "Your empire? Gone. We dug into your finances. Your network. You're one bad move away from spending the rest of your life in prison, or worse." Cain's face darkened. "You don't have proof." Jason slid a flash drive across the table. "This says otherwise." Cain hesitated. "Names. Transactions. Offshore accounts. Everything." Jason continued. "You finish us? That drive still gets out. And trust me, your real enemies won't be as kind as we are." Mike's eyes never left Cain's. "You have one way out of this," he said. "Disappear. Now. Leave the city. You come near my family again, and I promise you, you won't get a second chance." Cain stared at them for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "You win," he murmured. "For now." Jason smirked. "Good choice." Mike stepped forward, lowering his voice so only Cain could hear. "One last thing," he said. "Karen? She was never the problem. You were. And now? You're nothing." Cain's fist clenched, but he said nothing as the Callahans turned and walked away. The war was over. And they had won. The news spread fast. By morning, Cain had vanished. His men scattered. His operations collapsed overnight. Victor Hale confirmed it. He was gone for good. As for Karen? She had survived her attack, but with Cain's power gone, her influence meant nothing. Mike received one last message from her a week later. "Karen, 9:15 a.m. I lost everything." He stared at the screen for a long moment before deleting the text. She had made her bed. Now she had to lie in it. Life at Willow Creek returned to normal. With Karen out of the picture, the HOA was restructured. The neighborhood became what it was supposed to be, a real community. One evening, Mike sat on his porch, a cold beer in his hand, Ranger resting at his feet. Jason pulled up in his sleek black car, stepping out with a rare, relaxed grin. "Thought I'd check in," Jason said, grabbing a seat next to his father. Mike smirked. "Checking in or making sure I haven't scared off the entire neighborhood yet?" Jason chuckled. "Little bit of both." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You know," Jason said, glancing at his father. You could have just moved somewhere without an HOA. Mike took a sip of his beer, then shrugged. Where's the fun in that? Jason laughed, shaking his head. Peace had finally returned. And this time? It was here to stay.